So welcome to week 11 of our topical study of Psalms. This week we are studying the Psalms of David. We will be looking at Psalms that are identified as having been written by David. We will be covering what should be familiar territory. Many of the Psalms we've looked at in the previous 10 weeks have been written by David. And you probably remember he's identified as the author of 73 of the Psalms, which is almost half of the total of 150. And we will attempt to match each psalm that we look at this week to an event in David's life. And as you also already know, that is accomplished for us sometimes in the superscription information, and sometimes it can be determined with varying degrees of certainty by looking at the text of the psalm. And we will also approach this study from a lessons learned perspective. That is because so much of what David wrote in the Psalms seems to be saying, either don't make the same mistakes I made, or this is what I did to find peace in time of trouble. And those lessons from 3,000 years ago are still relevant today. So we're going to try to pick those lessons out from among David's writings. Now, this week, the reading for this week is Psalm 3, Psalm 7, Psalm 32, Psalm 34, Psalm 52, and Psalm 60. And we will not cover all these Psalms in today's study, but I chose this lengthy list so you could get an idea of the variety of topics and situations that David writes about in the Psalms. So if you haven't already read this week's reading, I encourage you to stop the video and read these Psalms before we continue. Okay, so let's start by examining some of the things we know about David as a psalmist. We know from superscription information that he wrote at least 73 of the Psalms. We know that New Testament authors attribute other Psalms to David. And let's look at one example. Turn to Hebrews chapter 4 and verse 6. And in Hebrews 4, 6 and going into verse 7, Hebrews 4 is an encouragement to those who are faithful not to fade away from the faith as some others had. And in chapter 4, beginning in verse 6, it says, "Therefore, since it remains for some to enter it, and those who formerly had good news preached to them failed to enter because of disobedience, he again fixes a certain day, today, saying through David, after so long a time, just has been said before, today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts." So here in verse 7, the author of Hebrews quotes from Psalm 95, verses 7 and 8, and encourages the reader to maintain a heart that is receptive to the word. And in doing this, he identifies the passage he quotes from Psalm 95, this as having been written by David. And if we turn to Psalm 95, we can see that the author of the psalm is not identified in the superscription information or within the psalm itself. So the only indication we have of the authorship of this psalm is from this passage here in Hebrews 4. And the next point we need to look at about David as a psalmist is that the things David wrote were inspired and contained prophecy. And in 2 Samuel chapters 23, verses 1 through 7, it is described in verse 1 of that passage as the last words of David. And this most likely refers to the last words he wrote as an inspired prophet of God, not his final words on earth. And they are presented in the form of a psalm, which is interesting. But let's turn there. Let's turn to 2 Samuel chapter 23. Second Samuel 23, beginning in verse 1, and I'll read verses 1 through 3. Now these are the last words of David. David, the son of Jesse, declares, the man who was raised on high declares, the anointed of the God of Jacob and the sweet psalmist of Israel. The Spirit of the Lord spoke by me, and his word was on my tongue. To God, the God of Israel said, the Rock of Israel spoke to me, he who rules over men righteously, who rules in the fear of God. So this passage tells us that David was a psalmist, and the things that he wrote were the words of the Lord, passed on through the Spirit of the Lord. And we have another example in Acts 29. And if we go to Acts 29, we have Peter appealing to the crowd gathered to consider what they have done in crucifying Jesus. So let's turn over there. Acts 2. No, I'm sorry, that should be Acts chapter 2, verse 29. Acts 2:29. And again, Peter presents to them words of David from Psalm 16 concerning who Jesus was. And he then says about David, beginning in verse 29. So it's Acts chapter 2, beginning in verse 29, going through verse 31. Brethren, I may confidently say to you regarding the patriarch David, that he both died and was buried, and his tomb is with us to this day. And so because he was a prophet and knew that God had sworn to him with an oath to seat one of his descendants on the throne, he looked ahead and spoke of the resurrection of the Christ, that he was neither abandoned to Hades, nor did his flesh suffer decay. So Peter speaking in Acts 2 tells us that the words of David in Psalm 16 are prophecy of the coming Christ. And then one last thing we need to look about David is that David wrote about the troubled times in his life. And this should come to no surprise of any of us at this point in our study. In past lessons, we've looked at historical psalms, lament psalms, and we've seen that David wrote about his trouble with Saul, about his anguish with the situation regarding his son Absalom. And we know these psalms were written by David from the superscription information. There are also other psalms written by David that address this distress and talk about troublesome times, which do not specifically identify the incidents which they're addressing. And we can speculate on some of those psalms as to what they are addressing. But what's most important in looking at these psalms is what we can learn from them. And we can gain encouragement from them, and we can learn about how David's relationship with God was strengthened or weakened by certain actions that he took, by certain beliefs that he had, and we can apply those psalms to our lives. So let's take a look at two psalms from the life of David and see what they teach us. First one I want to look at is Psalm 3. Psalm 3. And the superscription information tells us that Psalm 3 is a psalm of David when he fled from Absalom, his son. Psalm 3. And let's go back to 2 Samuel 15 and look at the beginning of the incident that this psalm addresses. So 2 Samuel 15. Leading up to 2 Samuel, we see that David's son Absalom was not satisfied with the way David had applied justice under his reign, and he begins to take some things into his own hands, including murdering his half-brother. And we won't go back and read the entire story in the previous two chapters, but this is the story of Tamar and Amnon. So that helps you put it in context. And what we see here is Absalom beginning a process of moving himself into a position of power, which will eventually lead to civil war. And he demonstrates he's willing to place the pursuit of that power above family and his country. But reading in 2 Samuel 15, let's read verses 1 through 14 to get the whole story. It says, Now it came about after this that Absalom provided for himself a chariot and horses and 50 men as runners before him. Absalom used to rise early and stand beside the way to the gate, and when any man had a suit to come to the king for judgment, Absalom would call to him and say, "From what city are you?" And he would say, "Your servant is from one of the tribes of Israel." Then Absalom would say to him, "See, your claims are good and right, but no man listens to you on the part of the king." Moreover, Absalom would say, "Oh that one would appoint me judge in the land, that every man would have who has any suit or cause would come to me, and I would give him justice." And then a man came near to prostrate himself before him. He would put out his hand and take hold of him and kiss him. In this manner Absalom dealt with all Israel who came to the king for judgment. So Absalom stole away the hearts of the men of Israel. Now it came about at the end of 40 years that Absalom said to the king, "Please let me go and pay my vow, which I vowed to the Lord in Hebron. For your servant vowed a vow while I was living in Geshur in Aram, saying, If the Lord shall indeed bring me back to Jerusalem, I will serve the Lord." The king said to him, "Go in peace." So he arose and went to Hebron. But Absalom sent spies throughout all the tribes of Israel, saying, "As soon as you hear the sound of the trumpet, then you shall say, Absalom is king in Hebron." Then 200 men went out with Absalom from Jerusalem, who were invited, and went innocently, and they did not know anything. And Absalom sent for Ahithophel the Gilonite, David's counselor, from his city Gilo, while he was offering the sacrifices. And the conspiracy was strong, for the people increased continually with Absalom. Then a messenger came to David, saying, "The hearts of the men of Israel are with Absalom." David said to all his servants who were with him in Jerusalem, "Arise and let us flee, for otherwise none of us will escape from Absalom. Go in haste, or he will overtake us quickly and bring down calamity on us and strike the city with the edge of the sword." So with that as a background, let's read Psalm 3. Let's go to Psalm 3. And this is what David writes concerning that event. "O Lord, how my adversaries have increased. Many are rising up against me. Many are saying out of my soul, there is no deliverance for him in God. But you, O Lord, are a shield about me, my glory and the one who lifts my head. I was crying to the Lord with my voice, and he answered me from his holy mountain. I lay down and slept. I woke, for the Lord sustains me. I will not be afraid of 10,000s of people who have set themselves against me round about. Arise, O Lord, save me, O my God, for you have smitten all my enemies on the cheek. You have shattered the teeth of the wicked. Salvation belongs to the Lord. Your blessings be upon your people." So here in verses 1 and 2, David recognizes that the number of those who oppose him are growing, and he sees that through Absalom's public relations efforts, many are turning against David and to Absalom as their leader. He also recognizes that there are many who are saying that there will be no deliverance by God. So based on public opinion, anyway, it appears that David has nowhere to turn. But in verses 3 through 6, David does the right thing in that he turns to God. He recognizes that a proper relationship with God is not based on how many followers he has or how many people share his beliefs. He knows that the idea of strength in numbers is irrelevant if you are opposing God. And this is the principle we see repeated throughout Scripture. So Scripture tells us that God's plans are not shaped by a majority rule or by what is popular among man. And as we read further in verse 5, David has such confidence in this principle that even in the world of turmoil, he says he was able to lay down and sleep. And so we can take this situation and apply it to today and looking at our own current culture. And we may sometimes feel overwhelmed by majority rule morality that we see in social media or in the news. And we can see that even today, we have a lot of Absaloms who are trying to influence and shape today's culture. And we can think of the times which we see an action by a politician or somebody in popular culture where it's analyzed in the news. And it seems like today the first thing they do is make an assessment of has it swayed people one way or the other. And they don't look at what's happened from a standpoint of was it right or wrong or was it good or bad. Instead, it's always what people did it sway, what people does he have as followers, what people will he get as voters, and so on. So the type of influence and the quest for power that Absalom used back then is alive today in today's world. Unfortunately for us, in the society where we live, most people who use that type of tactic to gain followers and gain power do not take it to the point of violence. So that's one good thing. But like David, we need to keep the proper perspective. And we need to apply God's standard rather than man's standard regard to how many people support us or oppose us. In the end, if we follow God's way, the number of people that support us or oppose us is irrelevant. And then the one aspect of this predicament where David realized he was powerless is found in verses 7 and 8. David knows that if he's outnumbered physically, that he has no hope physically, and he appeals to God for physical protection. So overall, the lesson David conveys in Psalm 3 is to maintain the proper godly perspective in times of trouble and turmoil, even when everyone else has turned against us. Okay, so that's Psalm 3. The next psalm I want to look at is Psalm 32. And in Psalm 32, David addresses the idea of sin and forgiveness. And the psalm can be kind of almost split almost in the middle, dividing it into two parts. In verses 1 through 7, David talks about what happens when we ignore sin and our need for confession. In verses 8 through 11, he discusses the process of ongoing forgiveness and the benefits to those who look to God as their guide. And many commentators speculate that this psalm was written in response to David's sin with Bathsheba, and I think that's a reasonable interpretation. However, there's nothing in the superscription information or in the text that definitively links it to that event. So let's go to Psalm 32 and read it. It's a short psalm. Psalm 32, beginning in verse 1. And the superscription information identifies it as a Psalm of David, but does not identify the historical context. So Psalm 32, verse 1. How blessed is he whose transgression is forgiven, whose sin is covered. How blessed is the man to whom the Lord does not impute iniquity, and in whose spirit there is no deceit. When I kept silent about my sin, my body wasted away, through my groaning all day long. For day and night your hand was heavy upon me. My vitality was drained away as with the fever heat of summer. I acknowledged my sin to you, and my iniquity I did not hide. I said, I will confess my transgressions to the Lord, and you forgave the guilt of my sin. Therefore, let everyone who is godly pray to you in a time when you may be found. Surely in a flood of great waters they will not reach him. You are my hiding place. You preserve me from trouble. You surround me with songs of deliverance. I will instruct you and teach you in the way which you should go. I will counsel you with my eye upon you. Do not be as the horse or as the mule, which have no understanding, whose trappings include bit and bridle to hold them in check. Otherwise, they will not come near to you. Many are the sorrows of the wicked, but he who trusts in the Lord, loving kindness shall surround him. Be glad in the Lord and rejoice, you righteous ones, and shout for joy, all you who are upright in heart. Okay, so that's Psalm 32. Now, many of David's psalms are psalms of lament. They express anguish or they talk of the danger he is in, and then in the end express confidence in God to deliver him. And we've just seen this type of psalm in Psalm 3. But Psalm 32 is different. Psalm 32 begins with David discussing the burden of unconfessed sin, but he very quickly transitions to discussion of the relief and joy of confessing and being forgiven. Verses 1 and 2, David tells us we are blessed if our transgressions are forgiven, and blessed if our sin is covered. In verses 3 and 4, he goes on to relate his own personal experience and talks about the misery he experienced when he did not confess his sin and seek forgiveness. And he talks about the pain this causes. He expresses how it caused him to physically waste away. He says, when I kept silent about my sin, my body wasted away. And then in verses 5 through 7, he tells how we obtain forgiveness and the joy that goes with it. David tells us in order to obtain that joy, we must acknowledge our sin. And then he then goes in and says in verse 6, let everyone who is godly pray to you. He's obviously expressing that prayer to God is the avenue through which we acknowledge our sin and ask forgiveness. And then in verse 7, he tells us that in order to preserve this state of forgiveness, we must make God our hiding place. Or in other words, we must adhere to the things God says and use him as our protector. And then beginning in verse 8 and going through the end of the psalm in verse 11, David lets us know that the process of forgiveness is ongoing. It's something that takes God's guidance in order to accomplish and maintain. And in verse 8, he says, I will instruct you and teach you in the way which you should go. So he goes on to compare those who have no understanding of God's instruction to horses and mules who are led about by a bit in their mouth and won't come near unless they're forced. And he goes on to compare those who have no understanding. In verse 10, he says, if you have no understanding, he compares those people to being wicked. He says, this causes sorrow for the wicked. And in the final verse, verse 11, he tells us those who are followers of God to rejoice. He says, be glad in the Lord and rejoice, you righteous ones, and shout for joy, all who are upright in heart. So those are the two psalms I wanted to look at for this week's lesson. We'll examine one more psalm in our study questions. And as I've said before, I'm certain there are lots of good discussions we're missing out on by not being in a classroom situation. But if you have any questions or comments, feel free to email me, engage in that discussion. But for now, let's turn to our study questions for this week. And question number 1 from our study questions says, what is the historical background of Psalm 3? What statements within the psalm indicate the historical setting of this psalm? So placing Psalm 3 within a historical setting is simple. That's because the superscription information tells us that this is a psalm of David when he fled from Absalom, his son. And as we've already seen, the events can be found in 2 Samuel chapters 15 through chapter 17. These chapters are the story of David's son Absalom, who gathers the support of a significant portion of the nation's people. He attempts to install himself as king, and this results in David fleeing. A civil war erupts that eventually leads to Absalom's death. And many of those elements are expressed in statements in the text of the psalm. So we have the superscription information, which directs us back to 2 Samuel 15, chapters 15 through 17. But within the text itself, we have a couple of indicators also. In verse 1, David says, O Lord, how my adversaries have increased. Many are rising up against me. So it's a recognition by David that the numbers are growing, that there's something going on which are turning people against him, and that number is growing. In verse 6, he said, I will not be afraid of 10,000s of people who have set themselves against me round about. So that gives us some indication of the numbers of people who are following Absalom and following Absalom's guidance. So the historical context is stated in the superscription information and is described in the text as well. So question number 2. Question number 2, what does David tell us about confession and forgiveness in Psalm 32? Can this psalm be connected to an event in David's life? Okay, so here, the superscription information won't help us set the context, but some of the things that are said within the text may. So back to the idea of forgiveness. One thing David tells us is that those who are forgiven is blessed. He's in verses 1 or 2, he says this. And if we hold to the definition of blessed that we've seen from other psalms written by David, then we'd have to say that those who are forgiven, this definition of blessed is that they find favor and have with God, and they have God's protection. And the second thing that David tells us is that when we keep silent about sin and do not confess it, it has negative physical, mental, and spiritual consequences. And Psalm 32 verses 3 and 4 say, Psalm 32 verses 3 and 4 say, when I kept silent about my sin, my body wasted away through my groaning all day long. For day and night your hand was heavy upon me. My vitality was drained away as with the fever heat of the summer. So, David points out these physical, mental, and spiritual things. He says God's hand was heavy upon him. And then a third thing David points out in verses 5 or 6 is God will forgive if we confess to him. And he says people who are godly will pray to God for forgiveness. So that the whole process, verses 1 through 6, give us the idea of what those who confess sin can expect in terms of forgiveness, and what they can expect in terms of being forgiven, and what they can experience in terms of not being forgiven, and the weight that it places upon it. So the second part of the question, can this psalm be connected to an event in David's life? Most likely this psalm addresses the guilt of unconfessed sin that David felt from the events of 2 Samuel chapters 11 and 12. And these chapters contain the events of David committing adultery with Bathsheba and having her husband Uriah killed in battle. And again, there's nothing that conclusively connects this psalm to those events. The context and what's said certainly does seem to address that, but there's nothing that we can conclusively say connects to those events. Most commentators will tell you that Psalm 32 is about those events. Okay, and then finally, let's go to the third question. Question number 3, what is the trap that the mighty man falls into in Psalm 52? What will be the consequences of the mighty man's action? So let's go to Psalm 52 and read the entire psalm. Psalm 52 says, why do you boast in evil, O mighty man? The loving kindness of God endures all day long. Your tongue devises destruction like a sharp razor, O worker of deceit. You love evil more than good, falsehood more than speaking what is right. You love all words that devour, O deceitful tongue. But God will break you down forever. He will snatch you up and tear you away from your tent and uproot you from the land of the living. The righteous will see and fear and will laugh at him, saying, behold the man who would not make God his refuge, but trusted in the abundance of his riches, and was strong in his evil desire. But as for me, I am like a green olive tree in the house of God. I trust in the loving kindness of God forever and ever. I will give you thanks forever, because you have done it, and I will wait on your name, for it is good in the presence of your godly ones. Okay, so the trap that the mighty man falls into in this psalm is described in verse 7, which says, behold the man who would not make God his refuge, but trusted in the abundance of his riches, and was strong in his evil desire. So in verse 7, David describes a process. It starts by not trusting in God. It moves next to trusting instead in an abundance of riches or in an abundance of anything, of our power, our position, fame. And it culminates in strong evil desire. And it's the idea that if I trust in my own strength, then I tend to make my own rules, which with man is almost always leads to evil. And we can look throughout history, anytime an individual man or a nation trusts in their own strength and turns away from God, they begin making their own rules, and those rules lead to evil. And again, we can apply this to our situation today. Do we view Congress, the Supreme Court, the president as the ultimate maker of rules in our lives, or do we view God as the ultimate maker of the rules in our lives? We see that when we entrust in those political entities, eventually out of it comes evil things. You could make your own list, I'm sure. We could look at today's culture of how that's happened. Instead, we need to maintain a focus on God that says God is the ultimate maker of rules in our life. And what will be the consequences of the mighty man's actions? The second part of the question, and those consequences are found in verse 5, where David says, "But God will break you down forever. He will snatch you up and tear you away from your tent and uproot you from the land of the living." So eventually those who make their own rules, trusting in their own power, fall at the hand of God. We know that. Okay, so that's question number 3, and that concludes our lesson for this week. For next week and for the 3 remaining classes we have in this quarter, I'm going to change the schedule that was originally published a little bit. I'm going to do away with a few things, and instead for the next 2 weeks, I want to look at Psalms in the New Testament. So next week, Sunday's topical class will be Psalms in the New Testament Part 1. There's an ample amount of information looking at Psalms in the New Testament. So I'm going to continue that again on going into May 24th, our second to last class. We'll look at Part 2 of Psalms in the New Testament. And for our final class, the last Sunday in May, we're going to do simply an overview, a review of Psalms, of everything we've looked at. And because I have some things going on otherwise, Jim is going to handle that study, and he'll be covering for our last lesson in Psalms a review of Psalms, a review of our topical study. So again, I'll add, if you have any questions or comments about this week's lesson, go ahead and email me, and I'm happy to address those. And I will try to get questions out for the topic of Psalms in the New Testament by midweek in this coming week.